Minoru Suzuki and Masakatsu Funaki were expected to perform well when Pancrase began hosting shoot events, because they were the ones performing well in training. While Funaki was upset in his very first bout by his student Ken Shamrock, Suzuki ran his record up to 7-0 in the first year of Pancrase, and looked incredible doing it. Much of Suzuki's ground game focused on the far side underhook. From side control, Suzuki would dig an underhook on the opponent's far arm, and use it to pull them towards him as he stepped around the head to collect the armbar or attack with a Kimura grip. You will see Demetrius Johnson still using this a great deal because it's a very strong fundamental series. What was unusual about Suzuki's use of the far side underhook was that he was one of the few fighters in the modern era to make use of the crooked head scissors. The head scissors choke is a technique you will see from time to time used as a double attack with the Kimura series, because attacking the Kimura grip will cause the opponent to lock their hands, and this prevents them from pushing the legs off their head. The crooked head scissors is a neck crank. The opponent's head is caught behind one knee and the other leg presses on the other side, flexing the opponent's neck sideways. Notice that Suzuki is posted up on his own head in order to have room to twist his knees, rather than lying flat on his side and squeezing in a typical head scissors. In his second bout in Pancrase, Suzuki submitted Vernon White with the crooked head scissors. While this was his only victory in this manner, he was able to use the crooked head scissors as part of a series of attacks, entering it from the armbar or Kimura attempts, and returning to armbars or Kimura attempts from the crooked head scissors after causing the opponent some discomfort. In those early years of Pancrase, S-gripping the hands and shelling up on the ground with the occasional big bridge and roll was the usual response to being taken down. So Suzuki used knee rides to force openings and dig for his underhook. The knee on belly is a standard in most grappling sports, but Suzuki got a lot of movement out of his opponents using the shin across the face or neck. Often he would use his hand to turn the opponent's face towards or away from him before hopping into the knee ride. If their head was facing away, they would likely turn to the turtle and expose their back. If their head was facing towards him, they would have to turn in and offer him the underhook. Or if they stayed there and tried to push the knee off, he would attack the hands or dig the underhook anyway. Khabib Nurmagomedov now uses the knee on face to pummel his legs in and drop on the mounted crucifix. Suzuki makes for an interesting study because he made use of many of the traditional catch wrestling techniques you hear about but just don't see today. For instance, here he mounts his opponent and they bear hug his waist. Suzuki weaves his arm behind their neck and in front of their shoulder, then dismounts and walks around them to create a neck crank. This variation is sometimes called a stockade. Then there is his use of the half Nelson and power half Nelson to set up arm bars and punch in rear naked chokes, or sleeper holds as they were known in Pancrase. Or here, as Suzuki kneels on his opponent's Achilles and attempts a quick Frank Gotch style toe hold from the turtle. This forces opponents to turn and face him. Many of catch wrestling's traditional punishing holds were not moves that held an opponent in place and forced him to submit, but rather moves that forced him to turn and effectively pin himself. This was the point of the famous Gotch toe hold, and Suzuki used it to flow into further attacks. In fact, while a lot of MMA and grappling has moved on since Pancrase, the outside heel hook to knee bar combination that Suzuki loved became a staple of the modern leg locking game. Huzimar Palhares was so dangerous with this one combination that he ran through to the final of his division in ADCC by entering it 3 different ways. But as Pancrase began a few months before the UFC, and the original roster was built of pro wrestlers trained by catch wrestlers, they had set expectations of what a shoot fight should be. The guard did not play much of a role in the earliest Pancrase events. And instead fighters tried to bridge and roll to the turtle, and then roll through on knee bars or reach back for double wrist locks. Ground and pound, while not illegal, also seemed to not be used in most fights on the basis of a gentleman's agreement. When fighters began to learn to play from the bottom, Suzuki had a lot more trouble simply dominating them from the top. Suzuki's undefeated streak ended against Bas Rutten, one of the first fighters in Pancrase to really make use of the guard and work effectively from bottom positions. Others quickly learned to follow suit, with Masakatsu Funaki, Jason DeLucia and Frank Shamrock all becoming quality guard players by the standard of the time. Furthermore, Suzuki was always a front-runner. Manabu Yamada gave Suzuki his second legitimate loss, a painfully obvious work against Funaki not included. By catching Suzuki late in a grueling 15-minute bout. Yamada wasn't one of the original Pancrase crew, but rather a fully fledged MMA fighter from Shuto, who had become the Shuto middleweight champion 2 years before Pancrase even existed. Yamada barely used the guard in that bout, but once other fighters started to reclaim and hold closed and half guard, Suzuki could be slowed down and gassed out more often. Minoru Suzuki got to 17-5 at the end of 1995 before the wheels really started falling off. His striking had started out bad and never got better. He tried to rely on kicks, but this got him taken down, and he was half the fighter from the bottom that he was from the top. He also ended up fighting at large size disadvantages and began to rack up injuries. Then there was the rope break, brought in to make things more interesting and give strikers a chance in the early days of Pancrase. But once fighters began to learn the entire game, this rope break only served to hurt Suzuki. It meant that sometimes Suzuki had to submit opponents multiple times to win a fight. Other times it meant that he could have an opponent dead to rights in an armbar, and this could happen. And often it meant that he would have to endure a horrible beating to get a takedown, then the opponent would poke their head under the bottom rope, and immediately be stood back up to the centre of the ring. But in many ways, there are parallels to be drawn between Minoru Suzuki and Kazushi Sakuraba. Both men were decent amateur wrestlers before they started training catch wrestling as pro wrestlers. Suzuki was mentored by Karl Gotch and Fujiwara, while Sakuraba was trained by Billy Robinson. Both Gotch and Robinson were Snake Pit alumni. Both Suzuki and Sakuraba outperformed their stablemates in MMA-style matches because they had strong amateur wrestling games to begin with. Both men's grappling revolved heavily around spinning armbars and the Kimura grip. In fact, they're two of the only fighters you will see repeatedly attempt this near side armbar from side control. And Sakuraba, like Suzuki, found himself fighting much larger opponents, struggling with the guard, and not knowing how to strike. But Minoru Suzuki came in excelling at what he knew, yet struggled to learn more. It was the way that Sakuraba adapted to the same difficulties that allowed him to continue having success in the ring until his injuries caught up with him. But that is a story for the second episode of A Filthy Casual's Guide to Kazushi Sakuraba. Minoru Suzuki remains a force in professional wrestling as a beloved heel, and is still putting on 4- and 5-star matches in his 50s in New Japan Pro Wrestling. I make these videos for fun and they aren't monetized, but if you want to hear more of my thoughts on MMA, I host a podcast every week called the Jack Slack Podcast, and I write articles at fightprimer.com. Cheers!